moderating in the Great American Literature series of webinars our discussion of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And what we are discussing in particular, the guiding questions for our panelists, what makes Uncle Tom's Cabin a great American novel? What effect did it have on attitudes towards slavery in America? Did the novel play a role in laying the groundwork for the Civil War? Who influenced Stowe's writings, and who did her writings influence? How would you describe her place in American literature? Now, I'm delighted to have two speakers today. In alphabetical order, Dr. David Reynolds is Distinguished Professor at the Graduate Center at the City University of New York, and there he's taught American Literature and American Studies, also at Northwestern, Barnard, New York University, and Rutgers, my own PhD alma mater. Yay. He is the author and editor of 16 books, which include biographies of Abraham Lincoln, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Walt Whitman, and he is the winner of the Bancroft Prize. You will see shortly in the chat button, I believe, a list of his books, as well as writings by Dr. Hollis Robbins. Dr. Hollis Robbins has just come over to the University of Utah, and she is now the new Dean of Humanities. Before this, she was Dean at the School of Arts and Humanities at Sonoma State University. She is a noted scholar of 19th century American and African American literature, and the author or editor of several books. Now, they are going to be speaking 12 to 14 minutes or so apiece. Then there will be guided discussion moderated by yours truly. That means you, the audience, put in your questions in the chat or Q&A buttons. I will pass them on, and or they can be answered by Drs. Robbins or Reynolds, who can also just talk to each other. When I pass on questions, I don't do it in the order they're received. I simply do it in whatever order seems like would make for a fun conversation. Now, the important piece here, if your question doesn't get answered, don't worry. Send me an email, randall@nas.org, RANDALL, and I'll be happy to forward your questions on to the participants so they can have the option of responding to you. So your question ought to get answered at some point, have no fears. Also, if you have to get off this fine discussion, it's being recorded, National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Within 24 hours, you will be able to see this for perpetuity, and send links to everybody saying, here, watch this. So, having said all that, in alphabetical order, Professor Reynolds, may I ask if you would be the first to speak?
Thank you very much, David. Great to be here. And it's funny you mentioned the Great American Novel. That phrase was actually coined by John W. DeForest. He was in the Civil War, also an author, novelist. And he coined it about Uncle Tom's Cabin, in an article for the Atlantic magazine. And he said, well, Hawthorne's pretty good, and Melville wasn't particularly well known at that time, but the Great American Novel is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Do we consider that? It kind of sank for a long time in the canon. In the 1980s, it really became revived by Jane Tompkins and a bunch of other scholars. And now it's very regularly read, certainly in the classroom. I teach it, I think, every year. And it's certainly worth reading. It's such a historic book. And it's certainly great in its kind of stature, its cultural stature. I happen to think that in many respects, it's a very powerfully written novel too. There are certain passages in there that don't kind of accord with today's views, but nevertheless, what I tried to do in my own book on Stowe is my book is called Mightier Than the Sword, Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Battle for America. And I try to discuss why it was so popular and what its impact was both in the short term and the long term. So, and why do I think it was so popular? Well, it was the first novel that I've read and I've read all the popular novels of that period and many other periods. The first novel that I've read that very successfully combined two genres. One is called the sentimental domestic genre, which featured home, family, familial relations, but also a certain kind of domestic piety and religion, and the sensational genre. Sensational meaning adventure, action, sometimes blood, kind of fast-paced material, and it's become a formula, really, of many TV shows. Breaking Bad, you have the family, and then you have all the action and blood and everything. I mean, it's become kind of a standard formula now, but it was really new, kind of back then. And a third element there was the political dimension, because it was driven by her anti-slavery passion. Stowe had attended a communion service, and instead of Christ on the cross, she had kind of a vision of a man being whipped to death, enslaved person being whipped to death, and that's like the penultimate scene, or one of the climaxes of the novel, with Uncle Tom being whipped to death. So, I mean, that was both sensational, that scene, but it's also very pious, because Tom becomes a Christ figure at that point. He's increasingly referred to Jesus Christ. It's also very political. He becomes a sacrifice to the pro-slavery power and all of that. But then she went back and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had just been passed, and she was really mad. And her sister says, "Hattie, you know how to write well. Why don't you go down and write?" So she wrote these episodes that were published in the National Era, a Washington newspaper, and they were gathered together in 1852 and published as a novel, and sold 310,000 copies in America in the first year, and about 1 million copies internationally, and then it went on to sell many more millions. And when you think about the novel, it's not just that it features domesticity and religion, but also it does so for enslaved people. And now, to us, that doesn't sound like much, but back then, there can be in Uncle Tom's a cabin with a family, with a father, with 3 children, with a wife who cooks, and a garden outside. You mean there can actually be a family of enslaved people? And then how painful that is then for the reader back then, and even for us, when the enslaved man, the father, is sold away into the deep South, and he's separated from his family. So that makes the whole family situation so painful, and it makes the reader, particularly back then, really say, "No, wait a second. Maybe enslaved people are not property. Maybe they're not things. Maybe they're not animals that we can just brand and chop their, ears off and all that. And maybe they're actually people that love each other, that can sing hymns together, and so forth. And then, yes, sit down and read the Bible as Tom does, with a nice white girl. Her name is Eva, and they sit together and they read the Bible. And ultimately, she dies. She becomes a kind of almost a Christ figure herself, and then he dies. So, and we know from the novel, in the context of the novel, they're going to heaven. They'll be up with the angels, and they'll probably be up there together. So it's, that's a very affecting thing as you're reading it. And the other plot also involves a family, but it leads to sensationalism, where Eliza Harris, her young boy, is about to be sold, and she overhears this. She grabs him. She runs across the ice to the Ohio side, and she manages to make herself, with the help of certain people up there, make herself north, where she finally is rejoined with her husband George, because he has escaped as well. And there's a very sensational scene, not only when she crosses the ice, but also when he is pursued in the mountains by slave catchers, and he actually takes out his gun and he fires. So that's a very sensational moment. And the plays that came after this, because there were many, many plays, became really the most popular play in American history, because what happened is that in 1852, a play was written, and then so many variations on it. Over the years, there were Tomers. There were families of Tomers. The father would play Uncle Tom, and the mother would play Mrs. Shelby, and the daughter would play Little Eva. But they were all over America. They're kind of crawling like ants from village to village, playing Uncle Tom's Cabin, so much so that most of the audiences knew all the lines in the play by heart, better than the actors, And in the plays, this is by the late 19th century. The novel itself was published in 1852. By the late 19th century, the plays were so popular that they needed 2 Evas, they needed 2 Uncle Toms, they needed 2 Topsies. And the dogs, in the novel, the dogs don't even make it to the ice chasing Eliza across the ice. They kind of bark in the no, they had to have huge Great Danes, and they would advertise the weight of these huge, tremendous mastiffs that chased the Eliza over the cardboard ice or whatever it was. And she had to have a little meat in her pocket to lure the acting dogs to bite her, kind of dangerous. And the whipping of Uncle Tom had to be super sensational and everything. And really, it was really during the plays that Uncle Tom becomes the kind of kowtowing, yes, master kind of thing. I mean, in the novel, he's 40 years old. He has 3 kids, a wife. He's described as muscular, as strong. Is he gentle? Yes, he's a very, very gentle Christian, forgiving guy. Yeah, he is. But he's not a weakling. He saves Eva when she's drowning, and then later, actually, he dies precisely because he's not weak. He's not because he refuses to tell where his fellow enslaved people are, where Cassie and Emmeline. He knows, where they're hiding. He says, "No, I'm not going to tell you." It's exactly the opposite of someone who's sort of an Uncle Tom in our sense. But on the stage, he became this kind of tottering older guy, sort of bald, and and then in Mickey Mouse cartoons by Disney, he could barely walk. "I'm coming, Massa, I'm coming," that kind of thing. Well, that was during Jim Crow, when he was kind of bastardized and turned into something else. To say that is not to say that it lost its political point, because it did feed into the Civil War. It helped polarize. If you read my book, you'll see it had helped to ignite the Civil War. Did Abraham Lincoln really say so? This is the little lady who made this great war. Maybe, maybe not. We know that he met her in November, just before the Emancipation Proclamation came out. We don't know for sure if he said that. Kind of sounds like he might have, but certainly a lot of people were saying that kind of thing back then. So whether he said it or not is really kind of moot. But what happened was that, yes, it became weaker and more flaccid in a sense over time during Jim Crow, but it made somebody angry enough named Thomas Dixon, who saw the play. He said, "I'm going to get back at people for this, whatever." She ruined the South. She killed 1 million people. This play is just disgusting. So he wrote The Leopard Spots and The Klansman, and that fed into A Birth of a Nation. It became the movie that really established the DNA for Jim Crow America. It was the most powerful movie. Today, it looks like kind of claptrap. Back then, it was like inventing the wheel. Histories of the cinema will say it was virtually like inventing the wheel. I mean, it's a silent movie. It looks very creaky today, but it made the Ku Klux Klan, you see, the heroes against African Americans and enslaved people, who were a bunch of lustful, people chasing young women and that kind of thing. And then another anti-Tom novel, which became the most popular movie in American history, Adjusted for Inflation, Gone with the Wind, was written by someone, again, who was trying to sort of get back at Harriet Beecher Stowe. So in a way, not only does the novel feed into the Civil War, but then it has a kind of afterlife in which people kind of bounce off of it and say, now, wait a minute, we can't love Black people that much and embrace them. And the South, Gone with the Wind says the South was romantic, and it's too bad we lost the war and all of that. So yeah, it really sets in motion a long thing. And the novel is translated into I don't know, probably Hollis will be able to tell you more than I do. Dozens of languages, dozens, and sometimes it was changed a little bit, like when it was published in Italy, they made it a little more pro-Catholic. It's a Protestant novel, really, but although, Harriet Beecher Stowe had certain Catholic tendencies. And when little Eva, she has like an image of Jesus on her, thing on her mantelpiece. And when she dies, she gives out pieces of her hair, almost like whatever offerings or relics, a very ritualistic death, so to speak. So, and her daughters, Stowe's daughters, went on, and a couple of them became high church Episcopalians. And so I think, even though Stowe herself came from a so-called anti-Catholic background with Lyman Beecher and everything, I think there was a part of her that kind of yearned for the high Episcopalian, or possibly even the Catholic Church. Anyway, that could be talked about for a long time. But look, I think I've exhausted my 12 minutes and maybe gone beyond it. And let's go on to Hollis.
Thank you so much. And yes, Dean Robbins, if you'd be so kind.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you. And thank you, David. You hit on some of the points that I think I was going to hit on as well. So we complement with an E each other as well as compliment. So let me see if I can share screen here. So I want to look to, does everybody see? Let me get to start from the beginning here. Is this showing up with everybody?
Yes.
Cultural afterlife. Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be here. And even though I'm in my first 3 weeks as dean at a new institution, I never pass up an opportunity to talk about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is, as Langston Hughes said, wonderfully the most cussed and discussed book of all time, which I think is exactly a great way of summing it up. And the cultural afterlife, as David put it, is really, most people know of Uncle Tom's Cabin actually from the way it circulates in popular culture rather than having read the book. Even if you've read the book, you still have to contend. And, one gets on arguments on Twitter all the time about how social media has changed everything, changed the way we discuss books or engage with popular culture, and that's just not true in the case of Uncle Tom's Cabin. From the very beginning, it has had to grapple with public perception of it and push back against it. So I'm just going to go through, a couple of things. It's serialized in the Free Soil newspaper, so everybody read it first in this newspaper format, without any illustrations. And the Tom shows, as David talked about, did appear almost immediately. So there was always a visual component and a sort of aftermath to this novel that Stowe had nothing to do with and was always contending with. Just again, if anybody doesn't know the plot, the sort of basic part of it is Uncle Tom, the strongest and most stalwart enslaved man on the Shelby plantation, agrees to be sold down the river. He, on the steamboat down there, he dives into the water to save the daughter of a wealthy New Orleans slave owner. This is little Eva. They spend hours together discussing Jesus. Eva doesn't understand slavery. He dies. The father dies. Tom is sold to the brutal Simon Legree, who has his own afterlife. Tom refuses to discipline the other enslaved individuals and is whipped to death. I mean, there's many other things, but that's sort of the major plot here. And the earliest drawings by Hammett Billings in the first published version, the novel version, the bound version, it was the first bestseller, right? It's a first bestseller for a whole bunch of different reasons that David spoke about. But it's important to know that this is also when the first illustrations came out. And the description, I'm glad you mentioned this as well, David, of Uncle Tom is really important to the book. He was a large, broad-chested, powerfully made man of full glossy black and a face whose truly African features were characterized by an expression of grave and steady good sense, united with much kindliness and benevolence. There was something about his whole air, self-respected and dignified, yet united with a confiding and humble simplicity. Now, it's a description that, certainly James Baldwin didn't like very much, but it is a description at odds with almost all of the illustrations after Hammett Billings. So here, as we said, by the 20th century, he's consistently depicted as old, and he still is, right? Almost all bald with the little bits of hair here. And this is well into the 20th century. Here's a popular postcard from the 1920s. This is sometimes at odds with the young strapping man that must rescue Eva in the water. But, again, even and I've looked at pretty much every book there is, in all of the teaching to read, you've got this old man and this young woman. Again, here's another illustration of Tom, who must be broad. He dives off the steamboat when nobody else will to rescue Eva. But then, again, almost every place else, he's this sort of doddering old man. On the films, illustrations, covers, there's just so many ways. Sometimes he's a little bit Greek in this one of these illustrations here, but it's really instructive to see the ways that the story, you could imagine different kinds of memes as they were circulating on social media, which is the social media of the time. He's consistently enfeebled. And, as John Updike said in reviewing my book with Skip Gates in 2006, most editions, the illustrations tend to whiten and sympathize Black characters and to desexualize Uncle Tom, who, as the father of young children, must possess a virility belied by his presentation as an avuncular oldster. Here's just another version, but consider this alternative. And I was really, really glad to see this version in 1866 by a Christian British artist, Edward Long, used as the invitation for this webinar, because it's really an extraordinary depiction of a very virile Uncle Tom. You can sort of barely see Topsy sitting there clinging to him, and you see Rosa over on the other side and Eva. And it's a description that is very much evokes the Christian aspects, which are fundamental to Stowe's novel, but not in a way that enfeebles him. So I was glad to see this, and we can certainly talk a little bit more about that illustration. And if for the Edwin Long fans in the audience, you should look up some of his paintings. He's a really extraordinary writer who tends to he's got a lot of beautiful paintings of people in various states of undress on Christian themes, on religious themes, and he does it without prurience, and it's actually really extraordinary. And we don't have to go through the details, but Stowe brings a lot of politics into her book, obviously, including the politics of rape, and in this, this sort of famous scene between Augustine, the father of Eva, who Tom has rescued, saying at the comparing race politics, but saying there's a pretty fair infusion of Anglo-Saxon blood among our slaves now, said Augustine. So this idea of the virile Black man in this book was not, and how it would be read was not unknown to Stowe. Anyway, I just wanted to have a few more of these images. and really, I mean, every artist of their day has had a chance to paint, and usually paints in the sort of same way. But there really was no place in American life for the figure of an adult male African American head of household. Unable to thrive without slavery, that slavery implied the wretched freemen yearned for the return of old ways. North and South joined forces, developing an agricultural peonage, sharecropping, kept in place by a web of political, social, economic limitations, eventually aided by Jim Crow laws. Visualizations responded with images of an idyllic South where the old folks remained at home. And the ultimate irony, African American characters such as Tom became loyal slaves in perpetuity. That's the great scholar Joanne Morgan in 2007, writing about this same phenomenon of this decrepit Uncle Tom image. And the stage versions did the same thing, but you try to compare, and I'd like to talk about what would it mean for Uncle Tom to be seen in popular culture as the virile character Stowe first intended. Other characters that are generally forgotten or less remembered when one thinks about Uncle Tom's Cabin in popular culture are George Harris and Eliza Harris. And George Harris is a really extraordinary character that I talk about when I try to sort of sell the book or sell the book's relevance and resonance to popular readers or readers now, especially in the Silicon Valley startup community. So Eliza Harris, as David had said, is best known for Crossing the Ice, right? And what's important about this is it shows strength and dignity. And Stowe really cared about the strength and dignity of her Black characters. I mean, it shines through not just with the questions of Uncle Tom, but Eliza here. In this scene of Crossing the Ice, which I think I first saw on a Little Rascals episode where they put on a play of Crossing the Ice. And it becomes, a signal moment, sometimes on the cover of books, of this Madonna and child. She's continually described that way or painted this way, fleeing in the Christian scene here. This is one of the more famous pictures, which then gets pulled up when Condoleezza Rice was becoming confirmed at the State Department. This was a cartoon that appeared in the Washington Post, I think. You see sort of Biden and Kerry as the bulldogs against her. So you could see that there was a certain kind of resonance there in perpetuity. And George Harris is really a character that should have more attention paid, because I think attention was paid at the time and not so much now. And I'm just going to read a little bit from chapter 2. This young man had been hired out by his master to work in a bagging factory, where his adroitness and ingenuity caused him to be considered firsthand in the place. He had invented a machine for the cleaning of hemp, which, considering the education and circumstances of the inventor, displayed quite as much mechanical genius as Whitney's cotton gin. He was possessed of a handsome person and pleasing manners, and was a general favorite at the factory. Nevertheless, as this young man was in the eye of the law not a man, but a thing, all these superior qualifications were subject to the control of a vulgar, narrow-minded, tyrannical master. The same gentleman, having heard of the fame of George's invention, took ride over to the factory to see what this intelligent chattel had been about. He was received with great enthusiasm by the employer, who congratulated him on possessing so valuable a slave. He was waited on went backwards here. He was waited on, I'm just having a hard time seeing, shown the machinery by George, who in high spirits talked so fluently, held himself so erect, looked so handsome and manly that his master began to feel an uneasy consciousness of inferiority. What business had his slave to be marching around the country, inventing machines and holding up his head among gentlemen? He'd soon put a stop to it. He'd take him back and put him to hoeing, digging, and see if he'd step about so smart. Accordingly, the manufacturer and all hands concerned were astounded when he suddenly demanded George's wages and announced his intention of taking him home. And as I see here, I'll just say it, for Harriet Beecher Stowe, Black Lives Matter. They really did. And it's extraordinary to see people who only understand Uncle Tom and Uncle Tom's Cabin through the insult of that word, to read the book and see what she was trying to do with these characters. I also want to, for the last few minutes in talk a little bit about the claims of libel and the hatred. I mean, we think about, again, social media as canceling and as the kind of wrath that can pour against somebody who is crossing public opinion. And as much as her book was a bestseller and embraced by the North, perhaps in complicated ways, the hate heaped upon her in the South was pretty much equivalent to almost anything you'd see in the news and news stories today. And in fact, pardon the analogy, but I kept thinking of Snow in the coverage of the Amber Heard trial, and the wrath and the scorn heaped upon this woman, because it was pretty much it was as bad as what was heaped upon Stowe in the South. It is deplorable that a woman should be the principal agent in this labor of mischief. We know nothing of Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe except from her book, but there's enough to grant her an odious notoriety. She has too much mind not to comprehend the wicked injustice and dangerous consequence of the distorted picture she has drawn of slave life. She has dipped her pen in gall of malevolence and has written one of the most powerful libels, which in an age has produced, full of all manner and uncharitableness and provocative mischief to be power to check if she would. Such a desecration of a woman's nature is a sorry and rare sight. This was the Daily Picayune. Southern Quarterly Review referred to her foul imagination, libels and slanders, spirit of mischief, the gross and disgusting vulgarity, the blunders and inconsequences, the obscene and degrading scenes. I mean, this was sort of, I'm just going to give you a few more. As a woman, she has unsexed herself, and as an advocate, she has stooped to falsehood. As a witness, she has perjured herself. As a mother, she is obloquy to her children. As a sister in our great national family, vilely slandered her own sisters, and as an American, expatriated herself by her own act. Arnold was a traitor, but the treachery of Mrs. Stowe is 1,000 times more black and bitter. The guilt of the former was the revenge of a defeated ambition, of the latter is the cold venom of a nature naturally and irremediably vile. I can keep going on. I mean, it's really high functions of the imagination to pernicious intrigues of sexual animosity and to the petty calumnies of willful slander. I mean, the number of times that she was accused of libel, defamation, and slander, I don't think really should ever be under considered in thinking about Stowe, her strength, and the strength of this book to continue to persevere in the face of this. Even she noted that another one noted that Queen Victoria had administered a severe but well-reserved something to Miss Harriet Beecher Stowe, and refused to receive the famous negrophilist at court. Mrs. Stowe was effectually prostrated. We hear no more of her in Great Britain. Not a noble lord or lady dare mention her name. This is basically saying that Stowe's been canceled by Queen Victoria. And even Thomas Jefferson Randolph, Jefferson's grandson, wrote that Mrs. Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is a foul and atrocious libel upon the slaveholders of the Southern states. It was garbage suited to the appetite of sectional hate. So here's a woman whose creative act is not only really powerful and has lasted to the extent we're talking about this now as a great American novel, but as a great American novel that underwent this kind of attempted cancellation over and over again, and also a cancellation by James Baldwin in 1948 for another reason in Everybody's Protest novel. And 4 years later, when she pens Dread, I don't have to read this whole bit, but she doubles down. She doubles down on the description of a powerful Black man in American literature. Tall Black man of magnificent stature and proportion. And she does this, in fact, to say, look we are going to have an America that includes everyone. Let me just end there and open it up to questions. I look forward to having the questions with you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you both so much. So I'll say to the audience, we depend upon you. Put more questions in, lots and lots of them as soonest, and do it already. So chat, Q&A button. I've got one thing, from iPad. I suspect this is a pseudonym. What is the origin of her novel? Had she spoken to someone who witnessed, such events as those she draws upon? Let me broaden that question a bit. She was, after all, in Massachusetts. To what extent what were her literary sources? What sources in terms of slave narratives? What stuff in terms of newspaper nonfiction? What in terms of sheer literary invention? And and I must say, and other genres. You mentioned the sentimental novel. That was, I think, Professor Reynolds, and so on. But in effect, how much is this a literary confection, and how much is this drawn from nonfiction sources?
Well, if I can address that first. She was born in Connecticut and raised there, but her father was transferred to Lane Theological Seminary in Cincinnati. That's where she met her husband. But that was right across the river from Kentucky. And so she met a fair number of enslaved people who were fleeing across the river. And one of them was Eliza Harris. There was a real life Eliza Harris. And she became close to John Van Zandt, who was brought to the Supreme Court for helping 9 fugitive slaves. He becomes John Van Trump in the novel. And he was a man who helped these fugitive slaves go north. He was convicted he was found guilty by the Supreme Court. But the original title for her subtitle was Not Life Among the Lonely. It was Uncle Tom's Cabin, The Man That Was a Thing, a very ironic subtitle, sarcastic subtitle. And when Salmon Chase was at the Supreme Court defending Van Zandt, he said, we can't call men things and we can't call things men. This is a man, a human being that you're defending here. And we just saw in the passage of the Hollis thing, George Harris by pro-slavery people was considered a thing. But Stowe says, no, he's not a thing. He's a human being, and he should be treated as a human being. And George Harris himself probably came from the slave narrative of Milton Clark, who was this mulatto man who was very intelligent and had been previously enslaved and everything. And then she wrote The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and she kind of Stowe did, and she refers to a good number of slave narratives, including Josiah Henson's narrative. He was she surely read Frederick Douglass's narrative as well, and she went once to Kentucky and visited a plantation, and her friend there said that she remembers scenes of Stowe looking around, sitting on the porch and looking around, and certain scenes that she saw there came into her novel as well. So, yeah. And then, as I mentioned, she had written a lot before Uncle Tom's Cabin. There were short stories, mainly sketches, never a novel. But she had kind of experimented with the sentimental and with the sensational, and then through the pressure of the political situation of the Fugitive Slave Act, which toughened the obligation of Northerners to assist in the return of fugitive slaves to the South. That really kind of was the last melding thing that brought all of this stuff together. Hollis, do you want to comment?
Sure. Yeah. No, you've covered the basis. I think there's a couple of other really interesting points about Harriet Beecher Stowe's upbringing and her reading, which is her relationship with her sister Catherine Beecher, which who in 1841 a treatise on domestic economy, which is a really important book, often overlooked. Catherine Beecher, unbeknownst to most political scientists, is really the individual that introduced Tocqueville to American readers. I mean, she had read Tocqueville in French, and she had thought it was a really great work, and quoted him liberally in 1841 in the Treatise of Domestic Economy about Tocqueville's travels around America and what he thought in talking to various Americans. And so this question of this voice, right? The kind of really startlingly effective voice of, like, in a Kentucky tavern, you kind of wonder, how's this little woman in 1850 capturing these voices? And she really read much more widely than perhaps our understanding of the Victorian spirit of the house woman is thought to have read. Besides the fact that she was traveling widely, she had a really extraordinary mind for listening to voice and understanding how people talk to each other. And again, I think, having read Tocqueville herself, and Tocqueville, really interestingly, left out a whole categories of people in his work. He famously never spoke to a Black woman. He did speak to some enslaved people and some women, but so many voices were left out of his view of America. And in some ways, she began to fill those gaps with her text as well. Yes, indeed, she read Douglass, and she wrote to Douglass saying, like, could I ask you a few details? And he was like, no. But they still had a very cordial relationship.
And we have to mention the death of Charlie, her little boy, who died in 1849 of cholera. And she once said, when Charlie passed away, that was really the birth of my deepest sympathy for enslaved mothers, many of whom lose their children. And it really aroused her tenderness and her sympathy. And she works it into the novel, not only the death of little Eva, but also in the death of the child of Mrs. Bird, who's one character.
And that was a beautiful scene in terms of, again, of the ethics of turning somebody in who's escaping. I mean, those two chapters in which the senator learns he is just a man, as I think it's called, is really a very moving chapter when he realizes that he's going to have to help this, having signed and voted for the Fugitive Slave Act, he's going to have to help Eliza escape. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to build on that, actually, to a question of my own. In fact, I remember that one of the series of critiques of Uncle Tom's Cabin was that it was sentimental, mawkish. Am I right in remembering this is one of the series of critiques? 2, when was this critique at its height? And 3, to what extent is it correct? How mawkish and sentimental, and how should we put it, sentimental in a polemical and negative sense rather than merely descriptive, is it? Or how should I put it? Does the sentimentality get in the way of its three-dimensionality as a description of personality and society and culture?
Well, I'll jump in to say, first of all, I mean, I guess the question is, what's wrong with sentimentality, right? And this was James Baldwin's critique, that if you have to change somebody's political views by making them cry, there's a problem there. And it's an interesting critique. This is in Everybody's Protest novel, of course, because in most of his work, as Gates and I talk about in our introduction to the Norton Critical Edition, right, he himself does a lot of work in sentimentality and than plucking the emotions, right? And what political ad and what political season does not include a certain amount of plucking as emotions in order to capture attention? I mean, TikTok does this as well, right? So any critiques of sentimentality, I think, has to contextualize itself and to say, does this word that circulates as a bad word actually signify something that we're all not very used to? But I will also say, and I'm sure David has much more thoughtful things to say about this, is that, it's interspersed. I mean, what is the opposite of sentimentality? Sort of iterations of logical reasons to oppose slavery in the current slave system. And there's enough of that. There's enough conversation. There's enough kind of data that's thrown at the reader that there's a lot there. So I wouldn't call it mawkish and sentimental any more than your average political ad every few years.
Yeah, there are a lot of really interesting and quite serious discussions in the novel of the problematics of slavery, the theology of it, the politics of it, the economics of it. And these are quite serious and thoughtful dialogues over this and enactments and so forth. Are there sentimental moments? Yes. But we have to realize that the sentimental, in a sense, works very politically, because simply to say that enslaved people, if back then enslaved people had deep feelings. They and in the case of Uncle Tom, he was able to bond through a kind of sentimental religion with a young white girl, and then she dies. And when she dies, it's funny. I've taught the novel, I don't know, hundreds of times, and I often use the Norton Critical Edition, which I like very much. But when she dies, usually it doesn't affect me, but I remember once I was sitting there, I started crying. I said, "No, wait a minute. Are you crying over little Eva? Are you kidding me? This is the sad." And in a way, what made me cry was that it's not delivered in really a sappy way. She's rather brave. She says, "Yeah, I'm going to die. Before I die, I would like to do something toward the emancipation of the enslaved people around me." She's kind of thinking of them. It's more that than, "Oh, boo-hoo, I'm dying. Oh, this is horrible here." She doesn't go through any of that stuff, and nor, frankly, does Uncle Tom when he dies. So it could have been much more sentimental, I think, than it actually is.
I would agree with that. And also, we should say that when Dickens read the novel, he thought Little Eva was just a little bit too close to his description of the death of Little Nell. But, there's enough to go around.
Let's see. So I'll mention there you're getting some deep pushback on the Amber Heard analogy. I don't want to go into that because, frankly, it's not actually the subject of this. But I just want you to know your readers are not, your viewers are not accepting this.
Let me just jump in briefly, because I knew I told you this was going to be what I was going to say. Something was provocative, which is to say that if you say something people don't like, people talk about it, you're going to get dumped all over and perhaps brought into court, right? Well, that was the pushback that she was getting, that Stowe was getting. And she did reach out to get lawyers, and she did reach out to defend herself, and she did have to spend a lot of time against accusations of libel and slander. And so when I talk about relevance, I bring this up not to make analogies, in terms of, do I think this person is like this person, but to say that when one says something impossible, that one believes passionately, whatever you think about the other recent trial, right? This isn't the first time a woman has faced a heck of a lot of pushback for saying something unpopular.
And I think one element that a lot of people forget that Hollis brought attention to is it didn't seem particularly sentimental or easily peppy back then. I mean, for a lot of people, this was a really scandalous novel. I mean, if you were either in the South or if you happen to be a kind of conservative Northerner, this was not a sappy throwaway novel. This was a dangerous novel. There was a black man who was living in Maryland, and he had the novel in his house, and he was condemned to 10 years in jail for even having the novel in his house. He fortunately escaped from jail, and he fled to Harriet Beecher Stowe later on. After 5 years, he escaped. But I mean, and some of these quotations that Hollis gave us, I mean, sentimental. No. I mean, this is flammable stuff. So, yeah, and it is kind of like today's cultural dialogue, because the nation back then was almost like the nation right now, where the two sides just can't really meaningfully talk with each other in any kind of meaningful way or logical way. And she cast the feelings on one side, but they're equally strong feelings on the other side. And it's kind of like today, where you have these things colliding, and so that in a way that's what makes it relevant, and arouses all the libel suits against a slave owner sent Harriet Beecher Stowe the ear of an enslaved man that had been severed and cut off and stuck to a piece of cardboard, and he said, "This is for your defense of the damned." I don't like using the following word, the N word, so I'm not going to say it, but he sent her an ear. I mean, it was very, very controversial stuff.
Yeah, thank you for that, because it really, and the fact that she was a woman writing this, right, is part of that. It was really, really easy to dismiss and degrade her personally over and over. I mean, I read some of the things that were just printed in newspapers, but the letters and the as you said, the other things that she received, when, again, I'm talking about putting this novel in culture. I'm not making exact analogies, but I think it's really important in any discussion of the importance of this novel was also the importance of her experience, right? We see her as some little woman that may have started a war and is mawkishly sentimental, but this woman went through hell after writing this novel. And I think that this is really an important aspect to teaching this novel and making it relevant now at this particular moment. So thank you.
And so much so that it was so controversial that when she went abroad and lectured, the crowds came out by the thousands to see her, but generally it was her brother or her one of her male relatives who spoke, because it wasn't really proper for a woman to speak. And she had been so savagely attacked as this, desexed woman and all that stuff, and the blue stocking. And so she sat there. She was very cordial and everything, but she really couldn't lecture at that moment.
And I will say, at the same time, having just read David Blight's wonderful biography of Douglass, I mean, Douglass too was getting beaten up on the lecture circuit fairly regularly. I mean, this was dangerous stuff, right? And I think, again, thinking about social media and cancel culture and how today it's worse than it's ever been. Well, no, no.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go to a question from Michelle Myers, a paragraph, if you please. Like every situation in life, let us be open-minded enough to consider that both life realities exist. There is just as much a possibility that some slaves of the day were valued and loved members of Southern families. Note that only 1% of Southerners were rich enough to own plantations and slaves. I'm going to just interject. Large plantations, this number probably refers to, there's more widespread small ownership of slaves, although it's still, I think, a minority of total Southern whites. At no time is it true that all persons would believe and react the same, both sides, Black Uncle Tom and white Little Eva. Let us hope that there are always those who go against the grain. We have no way to determine that Uncle Tom was any more real than Mamie in Gone with the Wind. And so I'm going to go with that one and push it also for you. Let me take it. Let me put this to you. Uncle Tom's Cabin is abolitionist propaganda and therefore not a very good novel. I want you to tell me what is the strongest argument you have read in the literature of, critics, both then and afterwards, that it is, abolitionist propaganda and not, therefore, a great novel. Tell me what is the best arguments you've read for that, and then if you wish to disagree with them, tell me.
Well, I mean, I think the best argument that can be made is that there's a reason why DeForest isolates this as the great. DeForest goes on and he writes wonderful realistic novels. There's a lot of realism. It's not a caricature. Uncle Tom is not a simplified human being whatsoever. He's not the type. An abolitionist caricature would be as follows. Oh, I'm so thoroughly, I hate slavery. This is horrible. And I'm so maltreated all times. Through most of the novel, Tom and frankly, most of the other enslaved people, except maybe Prue, she's used as a breeder. She's had 19 kids. And I mean, there are certain sort of cynical types over here. But in general, most of the enslaved people are rather textured. They're textured. And no, they're not always saying, oh, I'm so miserable and everything is horrible. So no, it's not really an abolitionist thing. It's not like Theodore Dwight Wells' American Slavery as it is, which is a litany of tortures on slaves, just one torture after another, It's not like that whatsoever, no. And in a way, that's what makes it really effective. Hollis, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I think that, and again, to return to George and Eliza Harris, right? This really kind of interesting young couple, who escapes, they escape to Canada. George is really interesting. He has a lot of speeches. He has his sort of moment of manhood and getting in a gunfight, and he's completely forgotten, right, by most anybody who talks about the novel is like, yeah, let's get together and talk about George Harris, right? And I find this interesting as what Stowe was trying to do with this couple, right? This couple is very much the promise of America and the lost promise when you disallow somebody with an inventive, such an inventive entrepreneurial mind like George Harris, right? I was out in San Francisco around the Bay Area for a long time, so you everybody's going to be a founder, inventing some new thing and make $1 billion and be a unicorn starter, what have you. George Harris is that character, right? And, he's got this lovely wife. They have this lovely child. This is the promise of America. And they're driven out, right?
Yeah,
and they're both complicated and interesting and forgotten, except for the crossing the ice bit.
Yeah. And at the very end of the novel, Harriet Beecher Stowe lists what she calls facts. There are certain facts of African Americans who have done quite well in the North if they're allowed to do well. There's a factory owner over here. There's a whatever, a farmer who's doing very well. And now she doesn't flesh them out, but she kind of envisages the integration and the success of people like George Harris himself was potentially one, he's an inventor, could be in Silicon Valley, as Hollis says. I mean, he's really, really super smart. So it's a lot more texture than simply being a horrid, abolitionist novel exposing all the evils and everything like that.
And I think you said, David, that you teach this every year, and interestingly, I never came across my desk in middle school or high school or college. I finally read it in grad school at Princeton, in a course by the great Bill Gleason on architecture, on American architecture in novels. Right? What a funny place to encounter Uncle Tom's Cabin, right? And we were looking at it in terms of an architectural lens, and I was transfixed. I was like, this is the book that I have heard about my whole life, and it is so rich, and it is so interesting, and it is so layered, right? And there's, I mean, you could teach it every year as you do, and as I used to, and find something new and interesting about it every single time. I mean, and so most of the critiques of Uncle Tom's Cabin are by people who maybe read it once or heard about it. Right. And thus it's, why is there still Bible study, thousands of years after the Gospels or in the Old Testament? It's just because you keep reading and there keeps things coming out of it. And I think, it's too rich and layered a book to be dismissed.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a follow-up question from a little farther back. I know this was a question which, why was the novel so widely read both in the United States and in Britain? But I want to actually twist that and particularly focus on Britain. My sense is that there's a rather large British audience and indeed foreign audience. Can you say something about its appeal abroad, and if it was read differently from the way it was read in the United States, how was it read by the foreign audience, at the time in later generations?
I'll jump in on one thing about this first. Before I forget, David had spoken before about translations, and even though it didn't need to be translated into the British English, actually one of my favorite translations. It was the first novel translated into Mandarin and Chinese as "Black Slave Cries to Heaven" in I think 1903, which is really an extraordinary notion that China thought that this was like a novel that should be translated for readers, and then retranslated under Mao some decades later to take out all the Christ stuff, which is also kind of interesting because what was left. And when you even think about something like The King and I, right, that sort of play within a play of the small cabin of Uncle Thomas, as sort of goofy as it is actually captures something about Stowe's novel, so that there is a kind of universality that I think translates globally. I want to say really quickly about Britain and about the Victorian novel and about the work that the novel form had done in England by opening up ways of living of other kinds of people outside of your class status and your region of the country. What the novel did is give readers a glimpse into other lives and other families, as David was talking about earlier, and so in many ways, certainly more than like The Scarlet Letter, Uncle Tom's Cabin was a novel that was a Victorian novel in that way of understanding what a novel does for British readers. So for their American cousins, Stowe came up with this, and they, again, there's resonances with Jane Eyre. There's resonances with other kind of messy things of Wilkie Collins and running away and gunfights and all sorts of things. So it was familiar, but you probably have other things to add to that, David.
Yeah, just to reiterate the international dimension, the many languages. It was smuggled actually into Russia, and in my book, Mightier Than the Sword, I discuss how it was sort of smuggled there and published sub rosa, and they kind of built a huge audience, and then it contributed to the emancipation of the serfs in 1861 in Russia, and later to emancipation in parts of Latin America and so forth. It had kind of a leavening effect, and Hollis mentioned China. I believe it was the first novel published in Chinese in China. And in England, to be sure, the Victorian novel, but also the fact that England had emancipated the enslaved people in its colonies in 1833, and beginning with the Somerset decision in 1772, there had been a more active and I think influential anti-slavery movement than in America. So there was a kind of built-in reception there. And Frederick Douglass, when he traveled to England, really felt less of a pressure of overt racism on the part of white people in England. And I think there was a certain openness there to Uncle Tom's Cabin, which may explain that why in the first year, it actually sold almost 3 times as many copies in England as it did in America. And mind you, not only did it sell, but the habit was to read it aloud to the family. So I've read one review that says for every reader, there are 10 actual readers, because they had big families back then, and they would sit aloud, they would read Uncle Tom's Cabin. So there were actually many more readers than there were sales.
Thank you. I have a very practical question from James Muller. Actually, the last question was also from him. Which edition of the book do you recommend with the exact text, but also illustrations that fit the intention of its author? And then, in particular, rather than portraying the protagonist as an old
Hollis
man.
does not to brag, but I really like the Norton Critical Edition. She doesn't have to boast. And what it does, it reproduces the original illustrations. Those original illustrations by Hamad Billings, they are not caricatures in general. I mean, maybe they're a little less realistic than they would be today, but I mean, compared to the presentation of African Americans in minstrel shows and popular caricatures, they're actually quite sensitive. And I came out with an edition called the Gift Book Edition, which was like a Christmas expensive, although my edition is expensive, but in which Hamad Billings had, I think, like 100 illustrations. And so I reproduced all of those in that edition. And I have an introduction comparing the way that Billings, that Hamad Billings presents these African Americans, as opposed to the way, frankly, they were presented in popular culture. But I like the Norton Critical Edition, and for many reasons. It also has an afterword with commentary, both contemporary commentary and later essays, including the Baldwin and including a bunch of other critics too. So, Hollis, you don't mind my bragging for you a little bit? Yeah.
Thank you. And yes, so I did the annotated version, not the critical. So I teach the critical, but yes, the annotated edition.
I'm sorry.
Yeah. No, it's all good. But I actually have the Miguel Covarrubias edition. So this was, I think, New York, the Heritage Press is the one that I like best, because his editions really from the 1920s are just, really respectful. Not all of them are awesome, but they give all of the characters. His name is, for anybody who wants to go look him up, Miguel Covarrubias, Covarrubias, does the work of giving dignity to these characters. And again, I think Stowe, I'm joking and not joking when I use the bumper sticker Black Lives Matter to her, because she really cared about strength of character, about ethics, about ensuring that there was a real respectfulness of these characters, even Prue, right, and Dinah, in the who have just had to deal with sort of really awful lives, that she takes care with her characters, and she takes care with even her bad characters too, to make sure that they're rich and layered, and have in some ways possibilities of redemption, even the worst of them. And I think that bears saying too. I mean, even Shelby at the very beginning, he's a bad man in owning slaves and selling slaves. I mean, bad, but more weak than bad. Right. And I think it's really important as a matter of character study. So what the Hamad Billings illustrations do some good work in sort of just presenting things as they are, but Covarrubias I think, does the best work in translating the dignity.
Thank you. Question from George Seaver. Could you explain the meaning of cabin in the novel? And I guess I want to expand on that. I think that people focus on Uncle Tom. Should they focus as much on the cabin? Is the cabin of equal importance to Uncle Tom in the novel?
Well, I'll jump in real quickly just because I brought that up in the context of this wonderful class taught by Bill Gleason on architecture. What's really interesting about the cabin, in the sort of context of, of this space, that it is, unbelievably clean and speaks to the kind of work that Chloe, Tom's wife, has had to do to have this spotless and space, small but filled with food, filled with prayer, with this image of George Washington. Wasn't it the image of the Black George Washington on the wall? That she situates, again, with dignity, this family in this space. And it's an important aspect of, sort of even going back to Ovid and mythology, the sort of humble cottage where respectable people live. And so it's important that that the family is rooted there before it is uprooted.
And readers back then, most of them accepted what was called the cult of domesticity. And the fact that this enslaved family with the wife, the husband, the wife, and the 3 kids, and they live in this very tidy cabin with some flowers around it. It might be even a little idealized, but she wants to show that these can be a normal couple, just loving couple living in their nice, tidy little house, just like any white person or anybody else. So I think the idea of the domestic space is very important.
And to add, and I think I saw one of the questions about this, about Northern white women, that Stowe was in many ways, yes, writing to these women. All of the illustrations of Eliza very much whiten her, and if you show somebody these images without telling them, students, where they're from, they don't racialize her, right? And that's the work it was trying to do. It's like, this is not an enslaved woman in the South. This is you. This could be you in another world, and that very much resonated. This Madonna and Child.
I'm going to go to a very specific question from Karen Conair. I have heard that Uncle Tom was compared to real-life Josiah Henson of Maryland, but I don't see the similarity at all. Why are they compared to each other? And if as you answer this, if you could say who he is, because I confess, I don't know who Josiah Henson of Maryland is.
Well, I mean, Josiah had published a slave narrative, and the deal was that he kind of got along with one of his masters, and he was entrusted to actually take some money on a trip alone. And Uncle Tom in the novel is allowed to do the same thing, and so they're both kind of faithful servants, so to speak. Although, other than that, there's not a heck of a lot of. I mean, I think it's wrong just to isolate Josiah Henson and say that he is Uncle Tom. There are some notable differences between the two. Hollis, do you want to address it?
Yeah, I mean, they're and I think I get called every now and again from reporters who are doing something on Josiah Henson's house, right? Because that's his claim to fame. It's not her claim to fame, and there's not a lot there. It just sort of comes up from time to time. I do think I want to go back to a little something about Dickens, I part of the reason I began working with Henry Louis Gates Jr. was on a novel that he had found or rediscovered, The Bondswoman's Narrative, that had been purportedly written by an enslaved woman in North Carolina who had fled north, changed her name, published this or wrote this novel and settled in New Jersey, and never published it. He found the sort of manuscript copy and spent some time trying to figure out who wrote it. And it has a lot of allusions to Uncle Tom's Cabin in it, and a lot of allusions to Charles Dickens's Bleak House. And in the course of sort of looking at who was writing and reading what in a transatlantic setting, and David, you probably you can add to this as well. I mean, Dickens was a huge influence on American writers and on Stowe. Frederick Douglass, in Frederick Douglass's paper in 1853, serialized Bleak House in the last page of his paper to say, like, and people would write in, it's like, why are you publishing? Why are you wasting time in your newspaper to this, to this white British guy that has nothing to do with slavery and the experiences we are having here, abolitionists? And he said, no, you have to understand, he is the novelist of character. He's the novelist of conflict, of interpersonal conflict, of family conflict, and of social justice at the time. And it's really important to think about Uncle Tom's Cabin in that context. And, to talk about, again, the scandal of her novel. It was scandalous, not just because, of all the things that she said about slavery and, what the Southern writers wrote about this, but that you take the novel form and use this novel form for this really much more overtly political purposes than Dickens ever did.
Yeah, and I think one of the chat questions was what was the reception in the North? In general, the reception, the reviews were quite positive. You can go on to this website called Uncle Tom's Cabin in American Culture, which is fabulous, and it collects all the reviews. And generally, the ones in the North are does much more than that too. That website is just amazing. But the Northern response was very good. Now there was some pushback. It is true that she sends George Harris and Topsy abroad to Africa to evangelize and spread Christianity and all of that. And some people called that sort of a cop out. Oh, that's colonization. The movement called colonization. And now, while that's true, we have to understand a couple of things. Lincoln talked about it, Thoreau talked about it, even Frederick Douglass, who hated the idea of colonization in 1861, thought about Haiti, emigrating to Haiti. There was a kind of back to Africa movement on the part of Martin Delany that was very powerful in the 1850s, just about the time that Uncle Tom's Cabin came out, because there was so much racism in the North that certain African Americans said, oh, we have to leave this hell. And so forth. So the fact that she does that at the end did get some pushback from kind of radical anti-colonizationists, but not as much pushback as you might think. The Northern reviews in general were pretty enthusiastic, and the reception in the South, as Hollis said, it was just horrendous. But in the North, pretty positive.
Thank you. I want to just repeat a comment from Oscar Wilde put in by R.E. Hinson. One must have a heart of stone to read The Death of Little Eva without laughing. Oscar Wilde is brilliant and should be quoted in all circumstances. I will just put that in. So you mentioned, books which, were written, against it later, the Klansman and so forth. But is her influence everywhere in terms of, here is, all right. Let me rephrase this. There's gotten a huge number of books which are, here is a sympathetic character, here is a horrible situation. Let us, do something of it. In the next generation, though, what would you say are the books that show her influence most strongly? And I suppose I would say, and which are the most interesting ones for literary value?
Well, I mean, I think some of the works of naturalism and realism were influenced by her. There was the muckraking novels. There was these novels of social protest that arise in the late 19th and early 20th century. And I think a lot of them were sort of either directly or indirectly influenced by Uncle Tom's Cabin. And also certain realistic, I mentioned DeForest, but there are other realistic novelists. There's a realistic texture to the conversation and everything in Uncle Tom's Cabin that I think influences the novel later on. And there was a whole school of anti-Tom novels by Southerners that tried to compete. And the point of those novels was, hey, these enslaved people are taken care of. They're happy. They're contented. Look at the indigent people. There was no safety net back then. Look at the indigent people in the northern cities. They are the real pathetic people. They're the ones that don't have any help. The enslaved people are cared for and they're happy. But in the north, they're just left to the streets and so forth. So there was that whole kind of anti-Tom literature. Hollis, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, and I think in some ways, I think the realism, right through with Dreiser, certainly through the 19th century and the Gilded Age, Rebecca Harding Davis, the Ironworks, certainly novels of labor and novels of social justice. Even I was thinking about The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's, story that this is a particular American version of that. I suppose even Grapes of Wrath owes something, once again, though, returning to the novel itself and these kind of strange chapters of long conversations with my students sort of skip through, but her capturing of the tone of how people speak to each other, some of the scenes of the Quakers and the peaches and the and the households and the dignity and the humor in these sort of side characters and the horror of Miss Ophelia and the domestic situation and at the St. Pierre plantation is or the household, really small and beautiful studies in American scenes and mise en scène, and I think can't be distilled down to anything. I mean, it's a novel that I mentioned Dread at the end of my presentation, but nobody reads Dread. It's just too darn long, and it's got this wonderful bit about the Nat Turner figure in the midst of a soap opera, and it's just she did something in this novel which is unique and sui generis. And I think we need to think about it that way, because there is no other Uncle Tom's Cabin. There wasn't before, and there isn't afterwards. And I think that is part of the respect we give to it.
So I'm going to do a question for teaching then. Is this a book where, you're both, I think, teaching it at the college level, the graduate level, but is it always a book which students are coming to for the first time? How many of them have read it, before they get to college? And, what do you need to, as students get, farther and farther distant from the Civil War, what needs to be explained to them to understand it, to get into it?
Well, very few. I teach doctoral students now. I used to teach both undergraduate and doctoral students, but now just doctoral students. And very few of them have read the novel, or maybe a couple have, but in general, my undergraduates, when I used to teach undergraduates, they had not read the novel previously. It's been kind of shunted aside, whereas Scarlet Letter, whatever, other books like that they're familiar with them. And I think there are moments in the novel. First of all, it's a hard novel to teach because the whole novel to, let's say, undergraduates, because it's fairly long. And I sometimes would teach excerpts, but doing that is kind of violates the novel. So I didn't teach it that often, frankly, on the undergraduate level. I teach it much more to my graduate students. And I think what I have to do is to contextualize, let's say, the departure of certain characters to Africa, to contextualize certain moments that certain passages that we would consider racial stereotyping and so forth, and kind of try to contextualize them. And they can be contextualized, but I think you have to explain that. Hollis, what's been your experience?
Yeah, I would say similarly. First of all, it's my favorite humble brag, whenever I humble brag, is that, when John Updike reviewed the annotated Uncle Tom's Cabin from the New Yorker and hated it, right? But it was such a thrill to have him read the book. He starts out by saying he'd never read it. Right? A sort of an important 20th century American novelist, having never read Uncle Tom's Cabin. I did an interview, a conversation a few years ago with Tyler Cowen in one of his conversations, and he had never read it. And he read it in order to have the conversation with me and loved it, and found that it was, again, coming to it as a certain, especially middle-aged man in America, I think is for anybody who hasn't read it, it's apparently delightful. So, but one of the hardest things to teach is hymn culture, because, or church culture or church going culture, because certainly up until probably the 1960s, 50s and 60s, the majority of Americans, or certainly a good chunk of Americans, went to church on Sunday. Didn't like it very much, but understood the basic stories, the basic characters, understand how hymns work and singing together, and what that entire sort of genre of uplifting poetry, as it were, how it worked. And if you don't understand that, if you are not used to at least once a week singing uplifting, praiseworthy things, then you're not really understanding what the characters are trying to do. So it's really hard to teach now for that reason.
Thank you. And so I am going to end my bit on this because I love teaching questions, and frankly, as ways to get towards the end of a session. Because we are doing this not just to discuss a book in the abstract, but to carry it on to a new generation. This webinar is itself a teaching moment, and it's good to talk about how books teach, how the younger generation gets them. Having said that, may I ask for some closing comments? I know that Dean Robbins has to get out sharp at 3:30 because she's a dean. Would you please go a last minute first? And if you have to leave suddenly, we know why.
Sure. No, first of all, I'm just going to say I'm delighted that you're spending time on this. It's great to talk to you, David, about your work, and read Uncle Tom's Cabin and read David's work and biography of Stowe, because she herself is really an extraordinary figure too. What she was putting up with and doing while she was writing, and understanding that sort of broader context. And when I tweet, my sort of tagline is, there are always precedents, right? And there are always precedents for the division, the scandals, the cancellations, all the things that we talk about now as being, brand new in 2022, has happened before in different ways, maybe with less church. And I think that that's a kind of an important way to think about this book and teaching it. So thank you for this. Thank you for this conversation. It's been really fun.
Thank you. And well, thank you so much. And Professor Reynolds.
Well, thanks to Hollis for her participation, and I know she has to go, but yeah, just read the novel. And one way to think about the context of the novel, its background, also its reception over time, is actually, I spent a number of years writing Mightier Than the Sword, and I kind of interweave her biography with the social background, the reception. And I think that if you see it in its total cultural terms, it's even more exciting. Although just reading the novel itself, if you can open your mind up even a little bit to the more, let's say, religious and sentimental now and then, if you allow for that, then I think you'll find a lot of really interesting scenes in there, and characters and compelling moments that might surprise you in the way they affect you. I really think so.
Well, thank you both so very much. So thank you. And to the audience, thank you very much. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. I will just say once again, this has been recorded. You can listen to this whenever, from within 24 hours on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel. Also, if you have questions, please send them to me at randall@nas.org. So I can forward them to the panelists. I will also say we are continuing to have the Great American Literature webinar. Our next one is, I believe it's July 26th, and I believe we are doing a Wendell Berry novel, although I'm not moderating. So if I'm wrong, I blame somebody else for being wrong. But the point is, we will continue to have this. Check us out. It will be every week or two, normally every 2 weeks going forward. Thank you all.